Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 8 What We've Learned video. So we're at another international break and we have the time now to reset, have a look at some of the numbers so far for team level data, for player level data, and even just expectations generally speaking, or any trends that we've sort of noticed from a Game Week 4 perspective moving along for Game Week's time. I'd also like to say that these types of videos do take a little bit of effort. So if you've enjoyed the content so far this season and you do really like this What We've Learned series, please feel free to support by pressing the subscribe button. And that would really make my day, especially if we were to get to 46,000 subs. The goal is to continue growing as a channel and hopefully maybe one day pursue it full time. But as it stands, I'm still a full-time sort of employed person. So a lot of these videos do take a lot of effort. So thank you guys so much for supporting. On top of that, I'd like to also thank 11ify and Schadenfreude. Their visuals and their sort of even models, for example, within the context of 11ify, really do help illustrate and bring to life a lot of the visuals that we have here and allow me to sort of color my analysis on the league, but also from an FPL lens. On top of that, I think I just want to mention that all the underlying stats that you're seeing within this video that were created for visuals that I created are all from the Opta Stats tool within Fantasy Football Hub. So if you want to have a look at the link in the description below, this will give you access to all the Opta Stats. Both player level data and team level data is there. And there's even more sort of interesting, unique pieces of data that I actually haven't shown within my videos, but I'm sure you can glean from. And on top of that, of course, they have the AI team rating tool, which also gives you expected points for a lot of these players. So you can kind of see how, for example, how the Fantasy Football Hub model is interpreting some of the data that we've almost gathered so far and how that's, spit out back into projected points. But let's just jump into the video. So to start off with, I actually wanted to look at Team DEFCON because I think Team DEFCON, as I've sort of theorized, so far, and I think it has been very much proven correct, is that the team CBIT level numbers, right? So this is not including recoveries. That piece of DEFCON information, I think, is very much correlated to generally how the average center back within a certain team does. And there's no surprise here because the top team in this list is actually going to be Crystal Palace. This is, I think, against our expectations in terms of, if you were to sort of think at the start of the season that DEFCON is correlated to the quality of defense, I think that's absolutely true. False, right? When you look at a team like Aston Villa at the bottom of this list and a team like Crystal Palace at the top of this list, it already tells you that sort of theory is just gone. I personally just think it's more of a playstyle thing. It's just reflective of how the team players. If you almost think about, like, I guess even a different sport like basketball, it's almost like whether you want to play higher octane, higher pace, and what you allow for your team and what that sort of means in terms of transitions, in terms of allowing your opponents to create clearances, blocks, and tackles and things like that. When you look at a team like, let's say, Aston Villa and Crystal Palace, like, what is the difference really? It's mostly actually how many clearances there are, how many tackles there are, less so interceptions and blocked shots, right? So those kind of numbers probably aren't super indicative of how good a team is at CBIT, but it's more about, I guess, how many positions you're putting yourself into in terms of being able to clear the ball and then also to tackle the ball in certain areas of the pitch, right? How aggressive, I guess, your players are allowed to be. When I think about this list and comparing it to, this list in Game Week 4, not too much has dramatically changed. I think you see a lot of the promoted teams in there, which once again sort of highlights the strength of the 4.0 defenders, specifically within that sort of one game scenario where you want to play them. Bournemouth are still extremely high, so that's no surprise. They're one of the teams that we all know are doing very well through Senesi, but also even within the context of how a lot of their attackers are very much involved within this whole process of getting C bits. Now, the attackers obviously benefit from recoveries as well. But the reason why I'm not showing team level data for recoveries is because I do think that is a bit noisy. And on top of that, I feel like the CBIT level data for midfielders is just a better reflection of, how much you can take away from CBIT as a whole. I don't think there's much of a correlation between team recoveries and then I guess their overall DEFCON and their overall DEFCON, not to mention that the defenders just don't benefit from that. West Ham, I think, is an interesting team to target. They're already top half here, and I think the expectation going forwards is under Nuno that this could actually mean that they could rise. And so I think when we look at the defenders for West Ham, this is something I really want to point out. Not to mention the midfielders as well, who are going to be involved within this process of being able to get hopefully more DEFCON down the line. Some early trends that I think are quite different from the preseason as well is that City's actually quite high up on this list. So is Chelsea. These were two teams that I think were very far at the bottom last season. This might indicate a slight change in terms of the way these teams play. But another thing that I wanted to mention in terms of big picture is actually the sort of team CBIT per match has actually just risen on average within the league. So I think some people have already pointed out that a player like Gabriel thus far already has much higher CBIT level numbers. And that's actually just a reflection, I think, of some small trends within the league that we'll talk about too. Something that I wanted to mention as well is you're also seeing that some teams that we probably expected to do a little bit better are actually not looking much better, right? So a team like Tottenham, in my opinion, have probably fallen compared to what we thought. We thought maybe under Frank, if you looked at the Brentford numbers last season, that they would actually rise quite high up on this list. But actually, it seems to be the case that they're not great at DEFCON, which I think is also, unfortunately, a bit of a dampener on players like Van de Ven and Romero, but then also Porto, right, who also has gotten some DEFCON here and there, but just not enough when we thought that maybe there'd be a bit of a shift of improvement there. If anything, Crystal Palace have actually raised a lot of their sort of averages this season in terms of these numbers, so I think that's very, very impressive. Wolves are also very, very high on this list, but I think part of this too is actually a full season of, let's say, Pereira so far compared to what was a mixture of Gary O'Neill last season and Pereira. So they're actually very high up on this list, and it might be the case that we could be looking into their defenders at some point in the future, but they're of course a little bit too expensive, I think, just for the quality of the defense. Other than that, I'd probably point out as well that Liverpool are reasonably high on this list, and I think that's once again a reflection of a change in play style. Other than Nottingham Forest, which, as we sort of pointed out in Game Week 4 already, was quite a radical shift from how they looked like last season. Newcastle were a team that were quite low anyway, so their numbers have sort of stayed the same. I think the key thing with DEFCONs, and some people were actually asking about what teams are the best to target in terms of DEFCON so far. I think we still don't necessarily have enough information to say that, because when I was actually looking at a study a Reddit user did for last season in terms of teams to target, a lot of the teams that I'm seeing in terms of DEFCONs against don't really correlate too well with that list. So personally, my view on DEFCON is just own players who play for good teams when it comes to DEFCON, or individually at least players who are really good at DEFCON themselves, and then worry about the whole kind of opponents played thing a little bit less, because I don't think that that's as correlative as just simply being good at DEFCON itself. I know it's a little bit of a simple lay analysis, but at the same time, generally speaking, most of the teams who are very high up in DEFCON tend to also give you opportunities to kind of get DEFCON yourself. So that's something that I think is still fair, but there haven't been really better theories than that, right? I think this is more a reflection of how a team plays, and then individually, of course, a player can sort of shine and excel within that. As far as individual level numbers, I wanted to actually go quickly through midfielders. So this will actually add recoveries towards the element of looking at CBIT so far. Now, unfortunately with midfielders, I think the key thing to also mention is that midfielders are just very bad at getting defensive contributions. So there haven't been too many midfielders who have gotten crazy sort of DEFCON hit rates, right? A lot of the hit rates that you can see here, especially even in the bottom half of this list, which is already a chart of, I'd say, the top 20 most relevant FPL players anyways, is very, very low. So the key thing is that threshold you need to hit is 12. So really you have to be almost averaging above 12 to actually have a really good estimated hit rate. And when I look at this list, I think the freak here is clearly Florentino Luis from Benfica. He joined Burnley actually a little bit after the season had started, so he's only played 297 minutes of football, but actually within those 297 minutes of football he's played 3 90-minute matches and then came on as a substitute for one of those games. So he's actually, truly speaking, from starts actually hit DEFCON every single game, and he might be that sort of gem in terms of DEFCON. But I think the big question is he going to do anything more than that? But if we're really saying that this player can actually come close to something like maybe 4 points per game, and it being true, then we could really be looking at an absolute gem here just from a price point perspective. Weaver, unfortunately, doesn't really benefit from the sort of rotation between him and Veltman. So I think the angle here is if someone like Veltman is injured, which he is, I think, right now, then the benefit is that Weaver actually can rack up a lot of consistent DEFCON as well. So I think he's someone to point out, but he's very conditional. Caicedo, we already know, has been incredible. He was one of the players that was touted in the preseason. This has pretty much stayed consistent. Anderson's numbers have actually dropped, and some of the other players here I don't really want to mention, like players like Andre, Cullen, Ampadu, Adams, to an extent, I don't think are very useful from an FPL perspective. It's just to iterate that they do exist, right? They're at that sort of 5 million price when they could be interesting. But I think Xhaka is a little bit more so because he does get you set pieces. Even Garner here, when I look at this list, is also someone who's very good at set pieces. So these are good numbers. Same with Bruno. Same with Sobo, I suppose, positionally, if you can almost guarantee that he's going to get a lot more minutes this season. I think the nice thing with Sobo so far is that he's proven to be absolutely essential towards his Liverpool team. So his minutes this season have been just much better, generally speaking, than compared to any sort of previous Liverpool season. Paqueta is actually on this list. Longstaff is on this list too. These are players who I think are very similar in terms of, let's say, that mold of a Xhaka or a Garner, where they do have some set piece share. And you've already seen so far Longstaff has gotten, I mean, assists, for example, in FPL, thermostat pieces, and he's kind of also taken Stack's job. Stack is also on this list, but as you can see, the DEFCON numbers for him on a per 90 basis have actually dropped a lot, right? Compared to his career numbers, which I think are somewhere within the range of, let's say, 12 to 13. This is a radical drop, which just shows you that the place that you actually play within the midfield compared to, let's say, his career of playing mostly defensive mid and center back has a huge impact on these numbers. Even Palhinha, to an extent, I think that's probably also a reflection of that sort of overall team dynamic of, are you actually that engaged within being able to get CBIT, but maybe your individual recovery numbers can shine through. So someone like Rodri, for example, has always shown, despite Man City's average team numbers not being very, very good. So I think Palhinha is more a reflection of someone of that mold, but still maybe being, stagnated a little bit by his team and how they sort of intend to play. Rice also very low on this list, but he's a bit of a jack of all the trades, right? I mean, there's still the set pieces there. Sure, there's some goal threat from time to time, but I think also a little bit overstated, which is why we've not had Rice, for example, the cheat sheet. So I think on reflection, who's interesting on this list? Florentino, if he can maintain this absolutely absurd rate. Caicedo, because he does play for a very good team, about to enter a good run of games, but has also gotten a lot of price rises. So I think maybe the time is gone, because at that point, I think at 5.8, close to 6, you're also asking for a lot more open play value, which of course he's given so far with the Screamers, but are they that consistent to expect, season long? Jacques, I think, at a great price. Garner, Longstaff as well, and then even Bruno to an extent, right? Especially with the penalties and sort of the dynamics there. He's been a bit unfortunate when you kind of look at numbers like that, him and Sobo, in that they haven't actually hit some higher numbers so far, I suppose. But these are all the players that I would expect going forwards to be able to actually get DEFCONs. Outside of this list, I'm not really sure if there's anyone who you're almost expecting DEFCON within any sort of game state. Moving on towards the defenders, because I think this is much more interesting, right? And these include players who've hit in, defensive contributions 3, 4, 5, 6 times within the season so far. So much higher hit rates across the board. I just wanted to kind of walk through this list. Senesi is the absolute king in CBIT per 90. Both of these lists have been filtered by, CBIT per 90 within the midfielders, and then also CBIT per 90 within the defenders, right? Just because I think the actual per 90 numbers are probably more indicative of future returns than, let's say, the hit rate so far this season, because the hit rate so far is still a bit noisy because we've only had 7 games of football. So I think someone like Virgil actually being so high on this list, but actually having some of the lowest hit rates compared to his peers in this category, actually is probably a good reflection that Virgil's still very good going forwards for being able to get defensive contributions. The same can be said for someone like Ekdal as well from Burnley. I think Tarkowski, we expect it to be fantastic, so no surprise there. Anderson has actually stepped up massively in terms of these numbers, right? So huge improvement there, and him being so close to Tarkowski is very impressive. And I think that may be also that kind of consideration of going forwards. Are you going to play these types of players more often as an auto sub, or even play them over, let's say, someone who has a slightly poor game in the midfield? I think it's kind of begging the question now that we have a lot of really good consistent CBIT per 90 players that are probably in our FPL teams, how often you play them within mediocre-ish games compared to in the past where you're just purely looking at clean sheets. So that for me is a big change. Mavropanos, I think, is actually very interesting here because he's got much better numbers than his peer in Kilman. And it seems like so far he is nailed under Nuno. So he might actually be a DEFCON beast that no one's actually really looking at. When I think about some of the lists that people have kind of curated so far, or even sort of discussion, like my initial reaction towards that West Ham match versus Everton, with them playing very good there, was actually, okay, Kilman could be an FPL option. But actually, when I look at it now, Mavropanos is actually probably the more interesting FPL option if you think that he's going to be nailed under Nuno's tenure. With Richards, his numbers have actually been better than Lacrosse so far. So a little bit sad for me as I've spent maybe 0.6 million on someone who does pretty much just the same thing when it comes to Richards. Obviously, Lacroix is probably a little bit better of a set piece threat potentially if you look at some of the career numbers, but very impressive for Richards. Clearly another player who's pretty underpriced, and the whole of Palace, right? When you look at this list, I mean, the team here that shows up is more often Palace because they also have 3 center backs, and I've also kept Munoz in this list, right? Some of the players in this list have been filtered out because I don't want you picking, for example, Agbedu, whilst he's actually not nailed for Wolves right now. So some of the top players within the game are not on this list. Lewis Dunk as well. I mean, Van Heck exists. So I really wanted to show just purely FPL relevant players that I think can play a part within our teams in the future, especially just given the injury conditions across the board. With Botman, he's on this list, but of course there's questions about, what happens if Shar is to come back into the game? Does maybe like lose his place in the team, or is it someone like Botman? Or are we going to continue to see, I guess, left back burn? And maybe that allows for a lot of the Newcastle defenders to play. But some of the Newcastle defenders, are on this list. And that is impressive, right? Burn a little bit further behind. But I think part of this is also because he's playing left back in certain matches. That's just actually going to be worse for DEFCON, which is probably why also Burn might not be that valuable if he, continues to play there. Estev is high on this list. Ekdal as well. We talked about how Ekdal at the start was actually doing a little bit better than Estev. They've kind of pulled it very, very close now, which probably means that maybe you still value Estev because he's a bit more nailed and I guess less injury prone than Ekdal. With Tosin, he's coming back from injury soon. Him and Chalobah have had really good numbers. I guess the big question with Chelsea is, can you see more rotation? For example, Tosin was actually rested or benched versus Man United, depending on how you see it, right? Maybe he had an injury already because he was actually injured straight after that match. Maybe it's a case of Tosin could still be nailed within this team. Or if you look at Chalobah, for example, it could be that outside of the red card, he could be still nailed. Or maybe Akyampong and someone like Hato could actually get some time back, and especially Badiashile, who's also looked really good in the absence of Tosin. So those are the kind of questions I do want to ask, because actually the Chelsea defenders have looked really good so far, but still quite a small sample size. Diakite is high up on this list, but nowhere near his peer in Senesi. So when we talk about Bournemouth, yes, they're really, really good, but I still think when you actually think about it, some of these Crystal Palace defenders are still actually better than Diakite anyways. So Richards, for example, even Guehi to an extent when you kind of factor in how much of an attacking threat he's been, or when you even look at the team like Bournemouth, I mean, Truffet has been fantastic too. I mean, he's actually looked like a very, very impressive left back. And some of the numbers so far for his sort of XAG are really promising. So is there a need necessary to go Diakite if you can also go for Truffet if you really want to double up on Bournemouth? Now, their fixture run isn't great, so there's not too much to talk about here. But just in terms of who you can pick from, I think you can still pick from, largely speaking, the players in that sort of top tier, that average 10 and above. Otherwise, I think I just wanted to point out that some of the other 4 million defenders are quite good on this. Rodon is here. Van Heck is quite good at 4.4. Saliba is actually quite high here. I mean, him and Gabriel actually featuring on this list is quite impressive. I think once again that sort of shows a slight playstyle shift within this Arsenal team. Someone actually asked me the question as well, if whether the left center back within the team or across the board with a lot of teams like Senesi, Gabriel, and Virgil was actually indicative of an overall theme within the Premier League. I personally don't think that's necessarily true, because if you kind of think about, Guehi, for example, for Palace, if you kind of think about maybe even like, let's say Dunk, for example, like they're still kind of worse than some of their peers who play on, right center back or central center back positions. So I don't think that there's any sort of trend in terms of left center back versus right center back. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of point that out. It is an interesting thought, but I think it still comes just down to the individual player, how they play. If I think about Virgil, for example, it's about sort of being aggressive, I guess, winning aerial duels a little bit more so often from defensive positions. And then also, I guess, if someone clears the ball to you, maybe at times, or sort of trying to make a line breaking pass, and how often you're the last man, those kind of elements I think are a little bit more interesting than whether someone plays left center back or right center back. But I think from this list, you can see there's a lot of options, and more options from some teams that we didn't really expect, right? So as I said, Arsenal, quite high up here, even Liverpool, but obviously there's an asterisk with Kanate. But that's it. That's sort of the DEFCON. I wanted to also show Romero, Munoz, Pedro Porro, and Goodmanson as well. That they probably wouldn't be in this complete list if I actually didn't filter out certain players that are not really FPL relevant. But the reason why I've kept them there is because they're very popular picks still and very highly owned. And I just wanted to show that there's still a bit of a gulf in terms of the DEFCON and the hit rate, of course, for these types of players compared to some of their peers. And just a reflection of that, right? We know that these are players who probably have a lot more offensive value, but that has been very much matched, I think, by the DEFCON that some of the cheaper players within their respective teams actually have. So just an interesting thought. Moving on to some team level data as well. I wanted to actually just revisit some of the NPXG for teams so far. So let's actually look at defense, since we're in the same vein here. Now, as I said, DEFCON doesn't really correlate perfectly towards defense, but it's still something you kind of consider in tandem with each other, right? You want teams that, generally speaking, have slightly higher clean sheet odds. So I think the reason why 4.0 defenders are great is because they do get DEFCON, but the expected clean sheets are very low. So for someone to be a 4.0 defender that I would play every single week is probably not something that I'd be looking for, because you're still looking at teams that probably are going to shop more than 2 goals per match. But unless they're a really good defense, which is actually the case that we can see with some of the teams so far, then that's where the value comes in. So the Leeds and Sunderland actually been super impressive, whereas a team like Burnley, for example, not so much. Even still, I think that we're very early into the season, so I would expect a lot of these numbers or these teams in their ranking positions to change. So if I was to kind of think about this list a couple of weeks back, Sunderland were much higher on this list and now are a little bit lower. And that's just kind of the impact of probably playing some tougher opponents and obviously the fortune, I guess, of, you know, a good game versus a bad game probably being normalized over time. So Arsenal have been excessively impressive. Newcastle as well, Bournemouth too. These were all teams that were quite high up on this list last time round. Man City being quite high up here, I think is a good reflection of things so far. The kind of column on the left is NPXGA, which is just taking the penalties out that you've given away, I suppose, and then obviously expected goals conceded shows a bit of a different picture, right? For example, a team like Forest have given away plenty of penalties. City so far have given a penalty as well, so Fulham, and that's why they probably look a little bit worse in terms of when you look at expected goals conceded. But actually, I guess the question you'd probably want to ask is are these teams going to consistently give away penalties, or is it more a reflection of you kind of look at their open play defense, like are they a bit better than we think? So I think Fulham being high on this list is no surprise, because we've always expected Fulham to be a good team defense, and kind of here they are reflecting it. Crystal Palace are actually comfortably mid-table, but I think that's once again a reflection that they've had some really tough games to go. So this isn't normalized necessarily by how tough the games have been for certain teams. A team like Palace has already played Liverpool and Chelsea and some of the pretty tough matches, especially away from home, like even Everton. So we kind of do need to think about that in mind. But the takeaways for me are that actually Wolves probably aren't as bad as people think, in terms of they're not one of the absolute worst teams in the league. They're still pretty poor, unfortunately. Chelsea actually are surprisingly low on this list, but I think they've also been really hard done by because of the kind of situations that they've put themselves in with the red card. So that could maybe change. But Aston Villa are also very low on this list. So Spurs too, and that's kind of interesting, right? I think these are teams that we probably thought would be a little bit better, maybe Aston Villa and Spurs, at least in terms of defense, not positively sort of good numbers so far, and Liverpool actually probably not as bad as a lot of us have thought. So I think that's quite interesting as a takeaway, because you know we have very strong views on certain teams so far and how bad they've been as defenses, but interesting to kind of see when you kind of take away the penalties how low certain teams are on this list. So as I said, Liverpool actually are probably a bit higher than some people would expect, even though I've been quite critical of them, probably even more so from an offensive point of view than more so on defense. But that's pretty much it. I think City being high up is a nice thing, because that's a huge step in the right direction, and they're actually a very sort of underrepresented team when it comes to ownership, right? Donnarumma and Guardiola are not super popular picks in the game, but maybe they're actually going to be quite competitive this season. Outside of that, I think there's not too much to say, other than Leeds have been probably the most impressive promoted side. I think collectively, actually, on both sides of the pitch, Leeds have been the most impressive for me. And this kind of still lines up with my initial view in the preseason, right? So it's kind of nice to see that, even though Sunderland's much higher up in the league table, that I probably actually have a little bit more faith long term with a team like Leeds. Now, if we shift over towards the kind of attacking stats, I think the attacking stats pretty much show you the story this season when it comes to certain teams like dropping in terms of our expectations. So when I look at this, I think Liverpool are not where we expect them to be, especially since Liverpool are no longer, for example, like a top 2, top 3 defense. I think we probably would have expected them to actually move in the opposite direction within offense, but actually they're not, leading the league in offense. They're not, even setting a little bit of a differentiation, right? Last season, they actually were the best offense by far. And now you actually have a team like City, who I think this is very much how City have been able to sort of utilize basically peak Erling Haaland, and that's a reflection of that within the sort of league table here of NPXG. Then Palace being second just shows you how good Palace has been. And once again, like Mateta, right? Mateta's had some great chances. Ismaila Sarr, we know, is a great chance getter. So someone who also has extremely good XG per 90 as an attacking player. So they have a lot of great threats. Even Munoz, Pino probably being a little bit more of a creator for this team. But they haven't lost too much in quality. And a lot of these matches are still, Sin Eze. So really impressive to see where they're at. With United, that's, I think, a positive signal if you own some United players, that Sure, they're hormonal, I suppose, as a team, if you want to put it like that, but their attack, generally speaking, has looked strong. And even when you take away the penalties, they're actually really good. Like, for example, if you actually added penalties back into this list, and obviously I'm salty as a Bruno owner, but if you add penalties back into this, United would actually be top. So their position right now is, I think, quite good, but their fixture run has been generally nice. Like, I think they've had some really good home games as well, including Burnley at home. With Arsenal and Liverpool, that's the interesting kind of thing that we kind of want to look at going forwards, right? Because we do own players like Gyökeres, we do own some Liverpool players still. You know, the question, I suppose, is, are these teams going to set themselves a bit further apart from teams like Palace and United, and how do things go with a team like City going forwards that have been able to get mostly the chances towards Haaland, but probably less so to some of their peers like a Foden, like a Reinders, for example. Otherwise, I think Brighton are actually very high up on this list too. They're a team that a lot of people don't like investing into, but I think from a price point perspective, when I think about Bournemouth and last season, like, I would say Brighton are kind of situated and probably priced in a similar tier, where I think they're a very good kind of top half team that a lot of people sort of tend to forget until they're probably going to maybe somehow make a move up in the table, right? But actually their underlying stats are very, very good and very positive. So there are a multitude of sort of Brighton assets that are at a very cheap price. It's just about also getting the returns from certain players. Like Gruda, for example, is pretty underrated, but then you still have Binte, who's just absurdly underpriced in my opinion at this moment in time. Everton have looked pretty good. This is a trend that we kind of pointed out at the start of the season, just based on the sort of offensive recruitments that they've had. Something that we did expect is just, are they going to be less defensive, which I think we've seen, and then be more offensive, which I think, you know, conversely we have. With Bournemouth, probably not that impressive so far. I think they've had a somewhat tough schedule too. Like, if you think about even some of the games that they've had so far, like they've played versus Newcastle, they've played versus Liverpool, they've even played, let's say, Fulham, for example. Like, they've mostly played very, very top level defenses. So I'm not surprised that they're not like top 5 within this list, but they're a team that continues to tick along, and I don't really have a surprise with, or, you know, with Bournemouth. With Newcastle, I think that's a little bit low. But once again, tough fixture so far, so let's see how they do. Still a pretty middling fixture run for both of these teams, so I think when I look at Bournemouth and Newcastle, I'd probably be interested to see by next international break where they kind of situate themselves. Tottenham's actually very low on this list. I think that's actually more a reflection of, I just haven't been impressed by their offense at all. So even though Kudus for me is still one of the best picks in the game, especially within the midfield position, just given the minutes that he actually plays and how much of a focal point of the team he is, and the fact that he takes set pieces, I still think Tottenham have not been impressive whatsoever as an attack. Maybe things could change though, especially if, let's say, they get a little bit more depth within the striker position in terms of, you know, Kolumani not having a dead leg, maybe Solanke coming back in a, you know, maybe 2 months time, since he actually did take surgery, which was a bit of a shock, but I think expected as well. So yeah, other than that, I think teams in this list below, teams like Tottenham and Fulham are just not impressive to me. Like, they're really poor offenses. Leeds United, Forest, Wolves, Villa, Sunderland, West Ham, Burnley, these are still for me some of the worst defensive teams in the league, and I don't really like the idea of investing into their attackers, unless their attackers are the sort of forwards who are still, for the most part, going to get the most chances within that team. So if I think about a lot of these teams and these attackers, for me, Brentford, it's still probably Thiago, despite his sort of suspicious minutes. Shadi's a little bit too overpriced, and I'd still bet on Thiago beyond penalties. If I look at Leeds, it's kind of just, you know, the DCL smell test here. I mean, do you believe it? Do you want to invest into it? That's up to you. Forest, I think their players are probably a bit overpriced, so I'm just going to skip through. Wolves, it's still Strand Larson, but he's a bit more expensive than some of his peers in this category, and they're not particularly setting themselves alight as an attack. And then Sunderland, we're seeing a bit more rotation in terms of the offensive players. West Ham, I really wouldn't trust Fulkrug, and Bowen really is still at quite an expensive price point considering he's a forward within the game. Paqueta is interesting because he's a bit more of an all-rounder. Some of his points come from, you know, things like defensive contributions, so it's kind of hard to see too much value from a team like West Ham or Burnley, but of course maybe Nuno can completely shift things around, but that's a reflection in terms of team level numbers. So I wanted to quickly look at some of these team level numbers and then contextualize them against model level numbers, right? So if I think about how to contextualize that, I've just used 11fi.com's team rating. So the team ratings clearly would have moved from a Game Week 4 perspective to a Game Week 8 perspective, and I think I just wanted to comment on what I see as shifts in terms of team ratings that I've noticed so far. And, you know, this is unsurprising given the football that we've had. That gives, let's say, a model a chance to sort of appreciate that information and also sort of recontextualize some of the teams. So Arsenal have clearly moved up into first here, and I think that's actually just Arsenal getting better as a defense. One thing I'd also mention, I think, when you look at this list, when I compare it to Game Week 4, the average kind of attacking rating for all these teams here, generally speaking, as a Premier League average, has dropped. So we talked about how, from a Game Week 4 perspective, the trend that we thought we saw was that the teams generally speaking, within the league have become a lot more defensive, or, you know, the flip side of the equation is people have just struggled to get offense off. So only a few teams here have actually improved from an offensive point of view when I look at Game Week 8 and then compare it to Game Week 4. I will specifically kind of isolate those teams that I think have made improvements in offense. But clearly, I think the big drop-offs in terms of offense would be Liverpool. Slight drop-off there. Even City, towards an extent, I think actually had slightly better numbers. But I think that could be, once again, the league average piece. Chelsea, but that's probably, once again, maybe skewed a little bit by just the unfortunate nature of the red cards more than anything. Newcastle have certainly dropped a little bit in this list. Bournemouth have actually dropped a little bit as well. Brighton and Crystal Palace are the teams, though, that have actually increased. So when I think about the top 8 here, the two teams that have probably set themselves a little bit more apart in terms of their offense have definitely been Palace and Brighton, which correlates as well to the underlying list that we saw. United have probably stayed reasonably level. Spurs have dropped off a little bit. Villa have definitely dropped off. Fulham dropped off as well. Brentford a touch. Everton pretty much where they were. Nottingham Forest, gigantic drop off, and I think that can maybe, you know, retain itself. West Ham as well, significant drop off. Wolves too, and then some of the other teams pretty much exactly where they were. So that's quite scary. Burnley actually a little bit worse off as well, but as you can see, the average, I think the average sort of expectation is probably less goals now, but very, very small percentages. Well, I'm talking roughly here, maybe like, you know, something somewhere between 0.03 to 0.04. So does that move the needle a little bit in terms of, do you play defenses more often than not? Maybe that does, right? And I think that's interesting to think about. If you kind of think about market odds every single week, the kind of goal scoring odds that we have, the assist odds that we have, and compare that to the clean sheet odds, I think directionally, if clean sheet odds are going higher and, you know, expected goals are going lower, then maybe you'll actually find yourself just naturally playing defenders more often, not just purely because of DEFCON, but because the league average of goals is actually decreasing. As far as defense, though, I think, you know, who are the biggest improvers? Somehow, some way, Arsenal have improved on defense once again. City have improved in defense, which is no surprise. Liverpool, a touch worse, nothing too crazy. Chelsea as well, a little bit worse, but I think once again, Chelsea are a team that have definitely been hurt by just the sample size so far. A model's not going to, for example, forgive Chelsea for having a red card. I mean, some models might, but I think 11ified, his model doesn't necessarily. But that hopefully comes out in the wash anyways in a few weeks' time, as opposed to sort of, you know, putting our hands up in the air and getting upset about it. Newcastle have improved massively on defense. Everton have actually also improved a little bit on defense too. So that, I think, is once again a reflection of some of the teams here. The improvements that have been made are kind of in line with the kind of general reduction that I'm seeing within XG. And then also with the kind of attacking ratings as well compared to Game Week 4. But I would say Crystal Palace have, I guess, navigated becoming a better offensive team whilst not losing too much in defense there. But other teams have made larger strides in terms of defense, including Bournemouth as well, and even Fulham to an extent. Otherwise, I just wanted to mention that, yeah, the kind of big drop-offs that I'm seeing is probably Brentford being a touch worse, Forest as well being worse, Wolves slight improvement, and then West Ham slightly worse, but I think that can just change, right? Especially if you really do believe in the new manager. Whereas within the promoted teams, you're seeing much improved numbers. And I think the most improvement that I've seen anyways for any sort of team and their team ratings has been Sunderland from defense. So going back to that point of the 4.0 defenders, I mean, Sunderland definitely improved, very interesting. And even Leeds, because the expected clean sheets for them are actually very reasonable. So those two teams, I think, once again, they're sort of proving themselves or continuing to prove themselves week on week. And I think that's a positive. Whereas Burnley, of course, you know, this I can't say something too positive about Burnley. They're probably the best team to target within the league, and also why I triple captain Haaland against them. But that's it in terms of team ratings. As I said, from an overall view, I think the biggest movers for me, if I think overall, would still be, you know, Arsenal definitely improving, Liverpool getting a touch worse, Bournemouth and Crystal Palace and Brighton, all these teams I think have been really good. United and Villa and even Spurs to an extent struggling to kind of match that sort of level. So that's kind of interesting, but they're all very densely packed against each other. Fulham and Brentford kind of where they were, roughly speaking. Forest getting worse, West Ham getting worse, but that could maybe change. Wolves actually, I think, a touch better, or probably where they were anyways, but actually some teams are getting worse enough so that they're actually close to Wolves. Maybe a positive for people who are looking at Wolves and how low they are on the table, if you want to think that they can still maybe get themselves out of a relegation spot this year. And then I think the biggest thing is that you've seen positive shifts for Leeds and Sunderland, and obviously there's been a lot of points on the board anyways for Sunderland and Leeds. So I think the relegation race is going to be generally interesting this year. So that's it. The next thing I wanted to look at is, moving on away from teams and team strengths, to kind of look at some of the sort of projected numbers that we have from the market odds, right? So this is going to be FPL Shadow's visuals. You can find them at FPL Shadow on Twitter. What I wanted to look at is specifically goals, not necessarily assists, because I feel like the assist markets just haven't really moved too much. We kind of know that a lot of the assist leaders, I think, are people who've gotten assists already or are just simply set piece takers, right? So players like even Dewsbury Hall to an extent, Longstaff, like these sorts of players have some sort of value from assists. But I think it's the goal trends that I find a little bit more interesting in terms of actually giving you guys a bit of food for thought. And in terms of underlying stats for players, I think that's going to be definitely a shout out for the cheat sheet, which will have the updated numbers from a Gameweek 8 perspective for all the players this season. So that for me is something that I'm very interested to unveil. So do look out for the cheat sheet this week if you're interested in sort of player level data for that. But in terms of projected sort of goal movements, I think Haaland, shooting up as much as he has is once again probably a reflection actually that he's almost peaking as a player. With Gyökeres, he's actually had a significant drop, and I think part of this is he's not scored, but then also the penalty kind of yo-yo has kind of hurt him. So his numbers dropping kind of in line with where they were in August, I think is just a reflection of, him benefiting short term with Saka being out, and then actually Saka coming back and taking penalties off him. Not a great sign for him, but his minutes so far I think have held up really well. So for people to be that pessimistic on Gyökeres, I think is a little bit of an overblown piece. Semenyo, though, of course, has scored so many goals, so his numbers have ticked up, but generally speaking, that's also a reflection of increased confidence within the markets as well, which is why you can kind of see that within the visuals. Same with Thiago and the amount of goals that he scored, obviously helped by scoring 2 goals versus United. Mateta, a touch higher, even though he's actually not scored that many goals so far. I think it's just a reflection that the markets are very comfortable in terms of having that sort of confidence level around a team like Crystal Palace. And maybe this is even like in spite of his minutes not being perfect with Nketiah coming back. With Isak and Salah dropping, I think that's simply just not actually getting goals on the board. Probably a short-term reflection on Isak's minutes as we continue to see him being subbed quite early and probably not being fully fit. And I do really think it's fair to say now that, yeah, this is an element of Salah being slightly, if ever so, being washed. And how maybe the market's reflecting to it, right? Beyond that, I think there's not too much to say. Like, I think Salah still, when you kind of think about how many midfielders are on this list, I mean, he's in a unique position outside of Semenyo, right, who's here and already scored a lot more goals than him. So it's almost still saying like Salah, if you kind of think about what the markets are thinking for the rest of the season, they're probably thinking more Salah goals despite Salah being and going towards AFCON compared to Semenyo. It's not saying that Semenyo is better than Salah. If you kind of take away the goals that have been scored so far, I mean, you're still expecting less goals per game for Semenyo than Salah. And no surprise, right? I think the value of being a Liverpool penalty taker alone is much higher than being a Bournemouth penalty taker. With Waltemad, I think it actually shows that the markets have been a touch pessimistic in the sense that he's been on quite a prolific streak so far. He's not going to get precluded from AFCON, but I think, yeah, the goal scoring numbers are good, but they're not that amazing. When I compare it to someone like Mateta, for example, across the board, who's actually scored 1 less goal, it's not like Waltemad is an absolute freak. So I think despite Waltemad being an extremely popular pick on the Wildcard 8 template, I don't think he's as strong a pick as people think, or maybe I'm just, too pro markets. João Pedro's actually dropped a fair bit, but I think that's just, not getting goals. Saka, slight rise, symptom, of course, of scoring the penalty as well, and I think just increased confidence there. So kind of, if we think about, let's say, September 26 and compare that to October 09, which is going to be, post Game Week 7 deadline, that change in terms of the numbers between Saka and Gyökeres, I think, is actually quite consistent with one, the goal being scored, and then a small movement in terms of penalty share between both players. Other than that, I think Watkins going down is no surprise. I think Wood going down is no surprise either. Welbeck, I think, has just been kind of bolstered by the recent goals and also the minutes probably going back towards his favor. Evan Nilsson dropping, I think, is just simply not scoring at all. Gordon going up, I think, is a reflection of the penalties now sort of being secured. So actually that jump between 8.25 to 10.25 to me is purely penalty share within Newcastle. And to an extent, if you kind of were to work backwards and think about Waltemad, it's actually positive that the markets haven't kind of docked his numbers after Gordon was proven to be on penalties. So just a confidence maybe in him and maybe, gassing or underrating him a bit too much. As far as, let's say, Gakpo, those numbers actually being a bit higher, I wonder actually if that's a reflection of actually well, first of all, he scored a goal versus Chelsea, but then maybe it's a reflection that he actually still has a huge role to play in terms of minutes this season, because I can't imagine that one goal versus Chelsea suddenly brings his total up 1.75 compared to September 26's numbers. So I feel like that's maybe a reflection of that, right? Maybe do we think directionally that Gakpo could have better minutes? Richarlison dropping, I think, is just a minutes thing. Bruno dropping, I think, is just simply not scoring goals. Like, he's had some great games so far and he hasn't scored goals, so I think that's a reflection of that. I don't think this is the market saying that he's off of penalties, right? This is simply you've actually blanked versus Sunderland, so you're just going to get taxed a bit for that. Enzo going up, I think, is a mixture of a lot of things, right? His underlying numbers are in the right place. He's getting a lot of chances. He's already scored a lot of goals, and then Palmer is still out for a while. Sesko, and Bowen, I think we'll continue to monitor that. But I do really want to mention that when you look at some of the forwards here and you kind of price mark or benchmark some of these players, I mean, Mateta is still doing absolutely great. I think Bowen potentially is one of the more overrated picks in the game, unless you have a lot of confidence in how much better this West Ham team is going to get under Nuno, right? Sesko as well, probably just a reflection of overall minutes within the team. Other than that, I think within the forwards, like if you're kind of looking at this list and just trying to benchmark players, I think Mateta and Waltemad are definitely really well priced. Even João Pedro to an extent, especially since you're going to focus your analysis on the quality of games that teams will have over the next 5 to 6 weeks first. And João Pedro is still an amazing buy when you put that into context. Whereas like someone like Mateta, for example, has a Gameweek 9 game like Arsenal away. So these are the kind of things we still want to think about. Evan Nilsson, I think, is still pretty fairly priced, all things being said, at 7. But then there's Waltemad right there. And why not just go for Waltemad? For Bowen and Sesko, though, I think, yeah, that's kind of the question of, are they sort of priced appropriately within the game? Maybe not. But Bowen, of course, I will also add, is a little bit more of an assist threat compared to some of the other players, especially since he's going to be now moving back into that sort of right wing position. So, I mean, definitely he's got a little bit more to offer, from his own perspective compared to some of the other players here who I think are a little bit more goal dominant, right? And you're asking for goals for them. But that's an interesting reflection of the season-long goal projection trends. Another list that Shadon provided was actually just some of the interesting key players in terms of goals. So this next graphic here carries through the sort of top level goals and then goes through towards the next. So Njai is very high up here, Sarr as well. I think this is just a reflection of Sarr being an absolute monster, to be honest, because he is going to go towards AFCON, and still, in spite of this, the markets are still very, very confident in him. But I think this is also just a general reflection of how good Crystal Palace have been as an offensive team. Foden dropping, I think, is just blanking within key games. Strand Larson, I think, is that sort of reflection of no goals so far, and then also just lack of minutes, and then maybe also a Wolves team strength thing in terms of offense. Now, DCL going up. Look, I know a lot of people dislike DCL, and that's okay. But I still think when you kind of benchmark here, is he in a pair? Is he in a tier of his own, really, at that sort of 5.5 price point? I think he is. And so he's interesting for me, right? Just from that perspective of, is he worth it for that price? Shadi is quite high here, but keep in mind he is 7 million in the game, so just not that interesting. And Bomo actually dropping, that's not something that I love to see. So I think that's a bit of a downer here in terms of someone and sort of his position within the game. Paqueta being quite high up here, I think, is a huge positive, right? This is a player who's at 5.9 who can also get some external points through DEFCON, so I think he's very interesting. Malin, I think that's a reflection of probably increased minutes in the short term, especially with that performance versus Burnley. Rogers, I think that's just a reflection of blanks. Kudus, to an extent, he has scored a goal, of course, and that helps, but generally speaking, I think we've seen him to be more of an assistive threat and less of a significant goal threat. So I think that's just that. Rutter, I think, is a mixture of minutes. We saw the benching last match. Minte, a slight tick up there. Overall, when compared to the preseason expectations, I think it's just a reflection of the confidence in his minutes overall, but not that he's going to set the world alight in terms of goals. Wirtz, I think that's just mixture of poor performance in minutes, as we've seen so far. Reinders has almost gone back to his, I guess, preseason expectations, but this was also after, I think, some really good performances within some of the friendlies, like including the Palermo match, and where he was already, I think, at 6.5 at a pretty good sort of goal total. But maybe this is the time to sort of recorrect our thoughts on Reinders. That drop here, I think, is maybe a signal as well as to his importance within the game and how much we sort of should reflect that. With Eze dropping, I think this is an interesting argument. I think a lot of people actually might take issue with where Eze is sort of put here. But sure, he's going to get a lot of minutes when Odegaard's out, but I think you can still see even within that match, he can get subbed. But then also, I think just price and benchmarking him, especially without the set pieces, he's not that interesting of a pick to me, but I can understand the appeal of it because Eze's been getting a lot of shots off. Like if I think about, games like, for example, the Newcastle game or even the West Ham game, he's gotten a lot of great shots off, like good opportunities with good quality chances, especially even the assists, for example, within the previous match was just simply him getting into a good spot through a Zubimendi pre-assist, which actually ended up being a Rice goal. So yeah, he's getting good shots off, but I still think it's a question of how many great chances is he going to get into within the sort of team, and then also how important are his minutes. And so maybe a pick that I find to be a touch overrated. Grealish is quite high up here, but I think that's just a reflection of him scoring a goal. Foster, not too much to say. Munoz, not too much to say other than he scored a goal. And I think, do you see a defender on this list outside of Gabriel or Timber? So these are the freaks, right? Munoz, Gabriel, and Timber. And Stack, I think it's probably an interesting question to see where his minutes will go. We have, of course, seen a direct free kick goal from him, but I think if we're seeing reduced minutes, like that's something I'd probably bet lower than, but just something to sort of mention at this point in time. And I think Dewsbury Hall isn't on this list, but I believe his numbers are somewhere around that sort of 5 mark as well. So still a touch better than someone like Stack here, but just an interesting reflection of goals and sort of the players that you want to be looking at this moment in time, and sort of benchmarking some of these players when you kind of think about the impacts of AFCON. So when I kind of look, at this list and kind of think back, Njai and Sar being very high despite going to AFCON, I think just shows you how much of a quality FPL asset they are. At the same time, I think Minte still is at a very, very good price point. I think Dominic Calvert-Lewin to an extent is also at a very, very good price point. So these are the types of players that I think are most interesting to myself. So that's going to be it for the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this What We've Learned series. As I said, if you want to look a little bit more of a deep dive into sort of players, the player level numbers will all be updated for the cheat sheet ready for Gameweek 8. So do look out for that and some more content as well within this international break. If you're looking for alternative pieces of content, do let me know within the comments. As I said at the start of the video, I would really appreciate it if you do subscribe. These videos take a lot of effort and a lot of work. And I do spend a lot of time, for example, week on week, just trying to get an understanding of how things are moving, right? How teams are performing and how I chart them against each other, how to benchmark them using models, using markets, and sort of interpreting between different sort of sets of data and projections. But that's pretty much it for me this week. I hope you guys enjoy the international break and enjoy some of the football that we have on offer. But yeah, please feel free to drop a comment because it does really support the algorithm. Like the video, hype it even, I think, which is a new thing, and subscribe. So take care, goodbye, I'll see you guys soon.